One, two.
Yes. Testing. It is work. Okay, red.
Right, good afternoon, gentlefolk. I'd like to give you all a very warm welcome this afternoon. It's unusual having a meeting on an afternoon, but it's an extraordinary meeting of strategic planning today. My name is Councillor Howard Greenman. I chair the Strategic Planning Committee, so I will be presiding over this meeting this afternoon. The first thing I want to check up on is that you can all hear me, okay? Can you all hear me at the back? That's good. We did have a few issues at the last meeting we had, which was only last week. It seems like 5 minutes ago, so I don't have any minutes to be proven or signed off today. Can I just ask, this meeting is live streamed, so I just want to be sure that all your devices, mobiles and so on are either turned off or on silent. We've had enough problems with IT one way and another without adding to them. Some of you may be parked in the County Hall car park. Don't worry too much if this meeting overruns. I don't intend it to. But it does have to see its full duration. But if your parking ticket does run out, don't worry about it. Parking services have been told, so you're not going to be clamped or have the car crushed or anything like that. As I said just now, the meeting is being live streamed, and that as from now. I should be ably assisted by the committee. You can see in front of you. Always good to have them here. And we've got the unitary member and cabinet member here too. Tara on my left. Democratic Services. She's always a very vital component in these meetings. Thank you for being here. Two planning officers, Rory and Jonathan, who will be presenting the case. Good to have Sai from Chippenham, our head poncho there, from the north of the county. And of course, our legal team too, making sure that we're kept on the straight and narrow. So without further ado, as I said, I do hope this won't be too long, but I am anxious that we listen to all there is. There are some nuances to this case today. It was due to come to us before, but of course, as you'll be aware, there have been some changes along the way and additional reports that needed to be furnished and so on. So I'm quite anxious that we listen to all the debate and we look at this thoroughly. So I'm going to be starting promptly now. We'll start with apologies. I think we've only got the one so far from Councillor James Shepherd. Thank you. Yes, we've got Sarah with us today. Good, that's good. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No, okay. There are no chairman's announcements. I may be saying a little bit in a few moments. But for now, I'm just going to go into the decorum behind public participation. So I'm going to summarise how the item is determined, how it will be debated, and how the public participation will work. So in a few moments, I'm going to ask the planning officer to present their report and explain what is his recommendation. And he may invite comments from other officers if appropriate, either at the time of presenting the report or later during the debate if necessary. I'll then be asking members of the committee to indicate if they have any technical questions which they wish to ask of the officers. We will then proceed to public participation, and I notice we've got a full complement of speakers today. Typically up to 3 objectors and 3 supporters able to speak for each item up to 3 minutes each. I typically give a little bit of latitude on those, but I'm not going to let you run away with yourself. So if you see me doing this, you'd like to perhaps wind up your comments before I do it for you. But as I say, I do give a little bit of latitude, and if I can see you're possibly coming to the end of what you wish to say, I shall let you complete what your point is. During the public slots for objectors and supporters, there are slots, as you'd expect, also for statutory consultees. And then we will hear up to 3 affected parish councils for up to 4 minutes each. I think there's just the 2 today. And after the parish councils, I will then invite the local unitary member, Councillor Ashley O'Neill, who you've seen on my left, and he will be then invited to speak. At that point, I will then open the item to debate. I'll ask the first committee member to speak to move a motion which must be seconded. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, officer advice may be needed to be taken in relation to any motion. At the conclusion of that debate, then I will then proceed to a vote. So is that all straightforward and clear? I don't see any shaking their heads, so I'll take that as being nods. Thank you. We'll come to that in just a minute. Planning's appeals and updates, there aren't any at this stage, but there is some clarification that we seek on the, and I'm talking really mainly to the committee here, for the cases that we had last week. You'll recall that the large one in Trowbridge, which was refused, was sort of hard fought and hard won, really. And there have been some issues that have come out of that since then. I've had a bit an exchange with Andrew Guest. He's not been able to make it today, but Rory was the case officer. And after some sort of discussion, there are going to be some slight amendments to the reasons of refusal for that big, the 185 houses, I think it was, in Trowbridge last week. So at that point, I'm just going to ask Rory if he could just explain the changes and why the changes are there. And good to have you with us, David, too. It's good to have the local member. Thank you. That's Rory.
Thank you, Chair. So, as said, since last Wednesday's committee, we've been working on the reasons for refusal for the Southwick Court application, referred to as H2.6 in the WhatsApp. I do have with me a copy of the draft reasons for refusal. If I could pass them round to members, that was.
Thank you, John.
That just contains the full text of the reasons for refusal. So some changes have been made to what was raised as policy in which to refuse the application against, and it's been considered necessary to run said changes past the committee again for your approval. So the purpose of this update is to seek members' approval on the changes made in order to issue the decision notice. So we came up with, I think it was 4 reasons for refusal. So one was the impact to the Southwick Court farm complex. And it's quite a lengthy reason for refusal, but I mean, core policy, so I'll read it in full and then I'll just explain the changes. So the reason for refusal reads as core policy 58 of the Wiltshire Core Strategy requires new development to protect, conserve, and where possible enhance the historic environment. Core Policy 57 seeks a high standard of design in all new developments. The policy further requires applications for new development to be accompanied by appropriate information to demonstrate how the proposals will make a positive contribution to the character of Wiltshire, specifically through 1, enhancing local distinctiveness by responding to the value of the natural and historic environment, relating positively to its landscape setting and the existing pattern of development, and responding to local topography by ensuring that important views into, within, and out of the site are to be retained and enhanced, and making efficient use of the land whilst taking account of the characteristics of the site and the local context to deliver an appropriate development which relates effectively to the immediate setting and to the wider character of the area. Core Policy 51 requires development to protect, conserve, and where possible, enhance landscape character, and more particularly, requires proposals to demonstrate that landscape features of cultural, historic, and heritage value have been conserved and, where possible, enhanced through sensitive design, landscape mitigation, and enhancement measures. The Southwick Court Farm Complex lies to the south of this application site. It comprises a Grade 2 star listed moated medieval manor house and Grade 2 star listed gatehouse and bridge, and related traditional farmyard buildings, some of which have been converted to other uses, all of which are situated at the centre of a system of fields and water meadows historically associated with the complex. The outline planning application proposes to construct a road across the field which lies to the north of the Southwick Court Farm Complex. Being in outline, the planning application provides insufficient detail of this access road to enable a full and proper assessment of the extent of the acknowledged less than substantial harm it would cause to the significance of the Southwick Court Farm Complex and its setting, and the contribution the setting makes to the significance. And in view of this, it is not possible to rationally weigh the harm against the public benefits of the proposal, as required by the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 202. The proposal is therefore contrary to the National Planning Policy Framework. It is also contrary to the core policies of the Wiltshire Core Strategy, referred to above, by not demonstrating and or proving a high standard of design and an appropriate development within its context, and not demonstrating and or proving that a landscape containing features of historic and heritage value would be conserved. So more specifically in relation to that reason for refusal, the principal change here is, I think the debate last week centred around less than substantial harm, but the word substantial harm was raised towards the end, And ultimately, it was on record that it was to be paragraph 201 of the MPPF that was to be referred to in the reason for refusal. 201 relates to substantial harm, and 202 relates to less than substantial harm. And it's the opinion of officers that we do not believe substantial harm can be justified in this context in relation to government guidance on the matter and the WhatsApp inspector's conclusions set out in his report. So with regards to the inspector's conclusions, the key paragraphs in the report are paragraph 89, 90 and 91. You know, to quote a few sections, in paragraph 89, he says, achieving a satisfactory form of development will be challenging. Nevertheless, I am satisfied that with great care there is scope for development of this site, and thus the allocation is acceptable in principle. In paragraph 90, he says, in the interest of effectiveness, modifications will be necessary to elevate these matters into policy and to provide greater clarity on matters such as access, drainage and infrastructure. In all cases, further guidance and information on what will be expected from developers should be provided. And that was, of course, written into the H2.6 policy. And then 91, the key point there is the delivery of the access road is clearly one of the most sensitive issues, as this would have to cross open land and would need to bridge the stream and take account of the water meadows. Nevertheless, the evidence is sufficient to support the view that in principle, a satisfactory form of access could be provided. So effectively, the inspector's decision has approved the application in principle, including the access road and bridge across the field to the north of Southwick Court Farm Complex. So for those reasons, we feel it would be difficult for a case to now be made that such an access would cause substantial harm to the farm. Had the inspector considered there would be substantial harm, then it seems unlikely that they would have, or indeed could have, accepted the principle of the access and thus the H2.6 allocation. And there's also planning practice guidance, which talks about how can the possibility of harm to a heritage asset be assessed. That's really the only guidance out there that we could find that would justify, gives some clarity on the matter about assessing whether a proposal might cause harm is on the significance of the heritage assets. And it's basically of particular note in the guidance is the reference to substantial harm having a high bar. In other words, total destruction or significant alteration to the fabric of a listed building are examples of substantial harm, but changes to the distance setting of a listed building, which do not directly affect the listed building itself, are very unlikely to cause substantial harm. They can, however, cause less than substantial harm, which is, in this case, as the conservation officer has concluded, within the higher levels of this category. So it's with that in mind, officers do not consider that a case can be made that there would be substantial harm. We consider this conflicts with the conclusions already drawn on the matter by the WhatsApp inspector, and that it would not comply with the guidance on what constitutes substantial harm. That said, we do consider that a case can be made in relation to less than substantial harm, and specifically on the lack of detail in the application to enable the harm versus public benefit test set out in paragraph 202 of the MPPF to be properly applied. So that's the first reason for refusal on heritage. The archaeology one, I don't believe there was any contention with that, but that just reads as core policy 58 of the Wiltshire Core Strategy requires new development to protect, conserve, and where possible enhance the historic environment. The historic environment is defined as including nationally significant archaeological remains. Paragraph 194 of the MPPF states that where an application site on which development is proposed includes or has the potential to include heritage assets with archaeological interest, local planning authorities should require developers to submit an appropriate desk-based assessment and, where necessary, a field evaluation. The application site lies in an area where there is potential for significant archaeological remains. Although the application is accompanied by a desk-based assessment, this is not considered to be sufficient in the context of the potential. The application's failure to include a field evaluation is therefore contrary to the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 194. It is also contrary to the core policy of the Wiltshire Core Strategy referred to above by not adequately demonstrating that the proposal would potentially potential archaeological remains. And below that, we've included an informative, which basically just says that the reason for refusal may be overcome through the completion of trial trenching in accordance with a written scheme of investigation to be first approved by the county archaeologist. And so I don't believe there was any contention with that policy. The highways one, there was a couple of points of clarity. So the reason refusal reads as Core Policy 60 of the Wiltshire Core Strategy supports and encourages the safe and efficient movement of people and goods within and through Wiltshire. This will be achieved by promoting sustainable transport alternatives to the use of the private car. Core Policy 61 requires new development to be located and designed to reduce the need to travel, particularly by private car, and to encourage the use of sustainable transport alternatives. The proposal makes limited consideration to the means by which pedestrians and cyclists cross the Froome Road in order to access contiguous pedestrian infrastructure to Trowbridge Town Centre, recreational facilities within Southwick Park, and bus stop provisions servicing buses in both directions, north and south. The lack of a pedestrian cyclist priority facility represents a disincentive to travel by foot, bicycle and bus, so leading to increased car-dependent travel. This is contrary to the sustainable development objectives of the core strategy policies. So in relation to that policy, you may recall that Highways Officer referred to lighting, or rather lack of lighting, as a potential highway safety consideration. However, we as officers are reluctant to include this in the highways reason for refusal, as the introduction of lighting alongside the access road and pedestrian path would raise fundamental issues for ecology and heritage, and so again go to the heart of and seemingly conflict with the WASAP. Inspectors' conclusions that the development is acceptable in principle. We have therefore just referred to the lack of a formalised crossing facility on the Froome Road as being a disincentive to alternative travel choices beyond the car. And then the final reason for refusal, which is one that we've introduced, but it's a standard reason for refusal to take account of the lack of an agreed Section 106 at the point of the decision. Obviously, such a legal agreement is necessary to provide mitigation for the impacts of the development. And again, an informative is added below the reason stating that the objection can be overcome through the completion of a satisfactory legal agreement if they decide to go to appeal. So that's really the reasons for refusal, and it's now down to members to decide whether they're comfortable with the slight tweaks to the policies that have been referred to.
Thank you, Rory. So I'm just going to notice your hand, Christopher. Thank you for that. I'll come to you in just a minute. The nub of it for me was really the difference between the two MPPF paragraphs, the 201 and 202. 201 states a substantial harm, and that's the one we used, and that is unquestionably the stronger one of the two. And MPPF 202 is less than substantial harm. And in my letter to Andrew Guest, I expressed my concern that I wasn't comfortable with the inspector's report. I wasn't comfortable with the conclusion that he'd drawn. I said, not that I disbelieve what the inspector said, not that I believe he's wrong, but that he can't prove he's right. And in my view, he can't prove he's right because we haven't seen the bridge, we haven't seen the road, we haven't seen the access. There's too many unknowns for us to compare, so we don't know whether it's substantial harm or not. But unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we can't fly in the face of what the inspector said either. And as much as I'm not normally very coy about objecting to what the officers or inspectors may say, I don't think it would be wise to sleepwalk into a situation where the inspector has explicitly said that we can't use MPPF 201 by doing so. So it has slightly softened the reason for refusal by using MPPF 202. But as Rory points out, there are a couple of other issues as well. So that's where I was coming from, and that's really what sort of kicked this whole thing off. Christopher, Councillor Newbury, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, this all looks very competent. Let me try bringing that a bit closer. This all looks very competent, and I'm going to say I'm happy with it. I noticed that we've got reasons for refusals 1, 2, 4 and 5, so it will need to be renumbered. It would be interesting to know what, I take it there was a number 3 that was the opposite of parachuted out at the last minute. It would be interesting to hear what that one was. 2 2, 4 and 5 seem to be fairly straightforward ones where the applicant could effectively overcome them by being willing to step up to the plate of finding some money for them. One is, I think, the crunch reason for refusal, that we would either win or lose on by the time we got to a hearing, if there was a hearing. And I'm just wondering, I had to leave, Chairman, I had to leave the last Strategic Planning Committee meeting at the last moment because I had an appointment to get to. Did we agree who would be representing? Were we able to agree who would be representing us for these reasons for refusal? Have officers come around to being willing to defend them, or have we found members of the committee who are willing to defend them, or are we going to employ a consultant to defend them? Can anybody sort of fill me in on
Yeah,
that front?
I'll excuse me, I'll answer that last bit first. Then I'll hand over to Rory for the other bits. Because you did ask me that on the day, and I did ask Andrew Guest. And he did say that we would have officers, apart from two, and I think he said that there were two elements of it that we'd find difficulty getting officers to defend our cause, so we probably would go externally for that. But for instance, he mentioned that Rob Rossiter would be defending our highways, etc., etc. So it will be largely officer-led, although there probably will be a couple of gaps, in which case we'll have to get consultants in.
Okay, that's good news. And then was there another reason that got abandoned?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll hand over to Rory for that. Thank you.
You see the two informatives that are added. I put them separately in the system, and then I thought I'd cut and paste them into the actual reason for refusal, and it hasn't renumbered so it's just a formatting issue really that I can sort out. And just to clarify from what the chair said, I think Andrew Guest was under the impression that the conservation officer and the highways officer from the council would be able to represent themselves at the appeal, but would be looking to outsource for the planning officer role. And there was, because core policy 51 was mentioned on landscape, there was a debate about having a landscape officer involved. But as you note from the reason for refusal, we've incorporated 51 into the heritage reason for refusal because we felt the debate centred around the sort of historic value of the landscape as opposed to landscape and visual matters. And we felt that then it can be covered by the heritage person rather than having a separate landscape officer present at the inevitable appeal.
Okay, Chairman, that's fair enough. I'll say no more.
Thank you for that, Rory. Appreciate that. Adrian, Councillor Foster.
Just one small point. Rory mentioned that the highways officer who gave it, and there's a lot of work gone into this, so thank you for all of that, but the highways officer did make it point out about the lighting and everything and being the issue. And there obviously is a conflict there with the back corridors and the environment. I'm just concerned that if the objection from the highways point of view is the crossing, because with the other two applications that we saw beforehand, we did put an informative in that we wanted it to be investigated, that a zebra crossing or a crossing for pedestrians and cyclists would be investigated. And therefore, it could be mitigated by those two previous applications. And therefore, we've lost a lot of ground on that one area.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point there. I mean, I think the applicants did offer to provide a formal crossing point for this application, but I think it was looked at design review and capacity of, well, the likely footfall of pedestrians going in that direction wasn't at a level that would justify a formal crossing point, and that's why it was downgraded to just a splitter island, refuge island. So the actual analysis that we've carried out doesn't indicate a crossing point is necessary, but we've had to try and find, some sort of meat to add to the core policy 60 and 61 arguments. And we felt that, going to the heart of the allocation itself and undermining the allocation would be to introduce this element of lighting, because the idea behind the road that the examination inspector was under the impression that it would be a very low-key road design, and only on that basis would it therefore be acceptable against the heritage asset. So if we're then introducing, it's a case of, do you want a fully highways compliant safety road, or do you want to preserve as best as possible the heritage asset? So I suppose if we are introducing lighting, it complicates the matter really.
I'm very anxious. This item should be longer than the main item on our agenda today, so I'm going to draw this to a close now on that note. So, all right, okay, sorry, sir.
Rory, just one quick question, and I apologize because I wasn't at the meeting, but the NPPF's paragraph 200, is that not more useful to us than 202? It's the one which states that any harm or loss to significant designated heritage assets, such as gardens, and it specifically mentions grade 2 star listed buildings. You didn't think that would have been more useful? It's just that only because 202 is quite easy to, because then we're into the balance, and that makes it much more debatable than the policy that they were talking about when they were in the committee, from what I can understand.
Yeah, well, I think the debate focused around the issue of less than substantial harm, and I think it's been agreed by all parties. There is acknowledged at appeal there is a spectrum of less substantial harm, and I think the appellants put the less substantial harm at the low end of the spectrum, and our conservation officer put it at the higher end. But ultimately, it's been agreed that there is this level of harm. I don't think the inspector has, the inspector even agreed there would be some harm, but that there would be potential substantial public benefits arising from the scheme that could potentially outweigh that harm. So we're all in agreement on the level of harm between the applicants and the council and etc. So that's why we felt that the best policy was the 202, which is effectively balancing that harm against the public benefits.
I might come back on that one yet. You're the unitary member, David. Yes, I will let you speak.
That's very kind. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Rory and officers, for all the work you've put in since last week on this, I guess, unexpected task. So thank you very much. I'm not seeking to amend this in any substantive way. I would just observe, though, that the inspector for the WhatsApp was operating a number of years ago and didn't have the benefit of seeing the flood risk assessments and the other plans, which led to the bridge being asked to be much higher than I think it had initially been designed. And currently we don't know what the actual height of that bridge is. So in light of the debate that you members had last week, I wonder if it's just possible to put in at the end of number 1 that members did consider the possibility of NPPF 201, but felt that because of the possibility of substantial harm that might be occasioned by the bridge, but in the absence of a design for that bridge, felt that 202 was the more appropriate one. Just to signal to the inspector that 201 was considered, because at the moment it's silent on that. It's just one thought. I don't know if you can add a line to that effect. The other thing is to do with the Section 106 agreement at the end, where we talk about education facilities, for which I think the applicants were planning to spend between £1 and £2 million. And we say this reason may be addressed by the completion of a Section 106 agreement, just sort of bluntly. I'm not sure whether it could be completely addressed, but tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm just looking at the Wayne Holmes appeal judgment, where the inspector said, this was in respect of a Section 106 agreement to provide payments. He said, I'm not reassured the school places for children and families moving into the proposed new homes would be available when needed. Coordinated delivery of the homes to school places could be secured if the appeal site was part of the larger strategic site, that's Ashton Park. However, I'm not convinced this would be achieved through the payment of financial contributions alone. So it seems that an inspector can actually challenge a Section 106 agreement on education on the basis that the places are notional rather than actual. And so I was wondering whether you might say this reason for refusal may be addressed or partially addressed by the completion of a legal agreement, just to indicate that we don't just feel it can be completely eliminated by just signing a document. Thank you very much.
I think, well, on the education, I can answer that because the education situation in Trowbridge is not apparently reliant on Ashton Park coming forward. There is, I think, a strategy to extend the existing secondary schools in the town as they have space to do so. I think there was concerns about the viability of a school on the Ashton Park site, given that it would be, I think it was 750 pupils it was forecast, and our education team are saying that, schools of that size for secondary schools aren't generally viable, so they would be looking to extend and expand the existing schools in the first instance, and therefore the money that is pulled from these developments would go towards doing that to provide the additional places necessary. So they are, I believe, confident that the Section 106 money that they attain would mitigate the impacts of the education requirements in Trowbridge.
Thank you for that, Rory. The issue, I think, with the other issue that I would have, I think, Sarah, with MPPF 200, is that we're referring again to substantial harm to or loss of, and we're up against the substantial bit again. So I think I thank you for raising the point, but I think we've got to stay with what we've got now. So on that note, I do intend now that we move forward. Thank you, David, for your contribution there. Are we, as members, all comfortable with that? Any dissenters? No? Okay. Right, okay.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say we ought to support that if that's the way we feel. Propose and second.
I think so.
Have a vote on that because we're supporting the officer's decision in this case.
Yes.
So, I'll please.
So all in favour, everybody's nodded. Yeah, thank you. Right, so to the main item of the day then, Land at Forest Gate, Pewsham. Thank you, Rory. You can go if you wish, but there are a few better places to be on a Thursday afternoon than here, so you might want to stay. Thank you, Rory. So Land at Forest Gate, over to you then, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. So to start off with, we have received some late items of correspondence. So submitted directly on to the file itself. 2 letters of objection have been received. The summary of these are they relate to the loss of agricultural land and impact on landscape, and both are considered to have already been adequately covered in the committee report. We've additionally had 2 other items of correspondence raising concerns at the lack of notification of local residents, either supporters or objectors. And the next point relates to no planning consent for the cable route to the national grid, and also consultation with the Wiltshire and Dorset Fire Service and concerns related to fire safety issues across the site. The 2 final points, again, have been adequately covered within the Case Officers Committee report. Turning to the lack of notification of local residents, the report for the application was published to the Council's website in excess of 5 clear days before the date of the committee, in accordance with the necessary regulations. So, turning to the presentation. This application is brought before committee to consider the merits of the proposal against the policies of the development plan, with a consideration to approve the application. The application is for the installation of a solar farm of up to 49.9 megawatts of generating capacity, comprising the installation of solar photovoltaic panels and associated infrastructure, including customer cabin, customer substation, DNO substation and equipment, inverter and transformer substations, spare part container, associated battery storage, access tracks, fencing, security cameras, landscape planting and associated works. The application has undergone amendments and revisions and the provision of additional detail during the course of the application. These have been consulted on in accordance with the requirements of the Development Management Procedure Order. The site is located between the settlements of Pewsham and Derry Hill. The A4 divides the main part of the site from a smaller parcel to the west of the main part. The topography of the land rises up to the southeast through Close and Derry Woods. The land is crossed by existing hedgerow and trees and is agricultural, with a growing of crops at present. Adjoining the site and east are county wildlife sites. These remain unaffected by the proposed scheme. And there are a number of Grade 2 listed properties along the southwest boundary bounding the A4 highway. And over 500 metres to the southeast is the Derry Hill Conservation Area. A footpath CALW86 runs along the east of the site and connects with a footpath, Grit 14, at Broomfield. There are a number of rights-of-way stopping opposite the site and bounding the north of the site. However, the public rights-of-way will remain available to be used by members of the public. Across the middle of the site is an oil pipeline which requires a buffer either side. So this first slide shows the solar layout, the photovoltaic solar layout of the site. Shows the solar panels and the access track and cabin locations as proposed. The panels are fixed modules, so they've been changed from trackers to fixed, with the cabins and storage units dotted across the site in appropriate locations. There will be enhanced planting that include enhanced biodiversity opportunities within and around the site, and the panels at their highest point will be 3.2 meters above ground level and fixed facing south. This next slide shows the planting plan. The application site does not lie within a protected landscape, and it is considered that the proposal would not affect the setting of a protected landscape such as the AONB. The North Wessex Downs AONB lies at over 3.4 miles to the east of the site, and the Cotswold AONB lies at over 5 miles to the west. The proposal retains much of the existing field pattern and boundary hedges, and it proposes to reinforce these with new and supplementary planting. The planting plan shows the green infrastructure across the site and how this will be enhanced through the development process. And the existing hedgerow and trees will be, for the most part, retained and enhanced, encouraging biodiversity routes across the site. It is recognised that the positioning of the proposed panels would be away from the boundary features, as are the mixture of cabins proposed, and the access track around the site fundamentally utilises existing gates routes through the existing hedgerows. As such, it is considered that there will not be a detrimental impact on the trees forming the site boundary or within it. No objections are raised by the landscape officer, and it is considered that the visual impacts would not have a significant major adverse impact and would be localised within this landscape. The next slide shows the site's ecological enhancements through, for example, the provision of bat and bird boxes within the site, along with proposed new ponds. The proposed planting will aid in creating a visual barrier between the site and existing properties and will also enhance biodiversity opportunities. Proposed boundary fences will be raised off ground level, which will allow passage for small animals across the site and through the provision of hedge gap creation. During construction, existing habitats will be afforded protection with buffer zones, no-dig methods within proximity to root protection zones, and through an on-site ecological clerk of works. There are no objections to the scheme from either Natural England or the Council's ecologist, subject to conditions. The ecologist is satisfied that measures can be conditioned to ensure that the site retains the functionality of its habitats for wildlife. Following slides show photograph views from localized vantage points. So the top picture here is taken from the A4 across the site. To the left-hand side is the field boundary with Forest Gate Commercial Park, and the wooded hill in the distance is Derry and Close Woods. The panoramic view below it is taken from the footpath between the site and Derry Close Woods. The following photos, the top photo was taken from a point nearby to the junction of the footpath to the A4 looking northwest. You can see some of the properties along the A4. Middle photo shows the field to the east from the same point, both of which show the existing hedgerows and trees across and bounding the site. The bottom photo shows the smaller area of land to the west of the main part of the solar farm, with trees and hedgerow forming the boundary. Again, these boundaries will receive enhanced planting, and those areas around the solar panels will be left to wildlife, meadow, and natural grassland. Following slides show the LVIA viewpoints along with a set of winter photo montages. So viewpoint 1, which is on that slide, again shows the photo was taken with the junction of Old Derry Hill A342 and the A4, looking across to the site in the distance. Next two photos, the top one is taken from the footpath, looking northeast, again showing the hedgerow and tree features within the boundaries. The bottom photo was taken from the footpath Cal W86, which meets the highway from Studley Hill to the north of the site. Because the site has been reduced in size, much of the solar panels that would have previously been viewable from this side have now been removed from the site in its entirety. Next two viewpoints were taken from a public footpath, Brem 47, looking south towards the site. And the lower photo was taken from Bencroft Hill to the northeast of the site. Again, showing the strong hedgerow and tree features in the landscape, which will act as screening for the proposed solar farm. This final LVI viewpoint, again, was taken from the A342 at the bottom of Derry Hill as you're coming up to the site, and it's looking north towards the site. The following photo montages were created from the junction of the A4 with the A342. The top one is year 0. The middle one is year 5, and the bottom one is year 15. These are all winter photo montages. So obviously in the summertime, one would need to imagine that the leaves and hedgerow will be in leaf, and again, adding additional screening along this part of the site. And what must be remembered is that this enhanced planting will be carried out along the roadside and of course through the site as well. But in terms of the localized viewpoints into the site, this enhanced planting will take place along the entire length of the road for both parts of the site. So the following slides show the transport route, construction transport route from the M4 down the A350 and onto the A4 to the site itself. So all construction traffic will be travelling along an A route for an approximate distance of just under 10 miles. Issues pertaining to highway safety impact have been clearly covered within the report, and the highway officer has confirmed no objections to the proposed scheme and that access can be safely achieved with both areas of the site, as is demonstrated within the right-hand picture, which shows the 2 access points into the 2 different parts of the site, demonstrating adequate visibility displays in either direction. So, in conclusion, the committee report is clear on the issues identified with the developments and set out the case for why this application should be supported. The Conservation Officer recognises within their response that the proposals would cause harm to the setting of the heritage assets through loss of rural character and agricultural appearance. They consider that the harm caused would be less than substantial and at the lower end of the scale. The public benefits of the proposal would include the provision of a renewable energy scheme generating in the region of 49.9 megawatts that would power in excess of 13,000 homes and save 20,000 tonnes of carbon emissions each year. There would also be net gain for biodiversity arising from the planned landscaping and ecological proposals, which would be a substantial benefit. The recommendation reached within the case officer's assessment is that the public benefits outweigh the less than substantial harm to the setting of the nearby heritage assets. During the course of the application, technical issues relating to highways, landscape, heritage and ecology have been considered, resolved, and conditions imposed can ensure a satisfactory development meeting the criteria of the relevant policies on these matters. It is considered that the combined impact on heritage, landscape, impact, ecology, temporary increase in traffic would lead to a degree of negative cumulative impact. However, it is also considered that these significant benefits through the provision of a solar farm generating renewable energy for in excess of 13,000 homes would outweigh the identified limited impacts of the scheme. In light of the significant benefits that the provision of this solar farm would have on this location, in balance against the level of harm identified, it is considered that this application is supported by officers subject to the conditions as identified within this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. So on that note, members, questions? Right, okay, Christopher. Councillor Newbury, please, first.
Thank you, Chair. One thing that really surprised me about this report, Chairman, is that there's very little sign of objections to this scheme. We have, CPRE has sent in a long and detailed objection, which seems pretty well reasoned to me, but so far as I can make out, the sort of resident objections are wrapped together in a heading called Other, and so far as they can be identified, they seem to be supportive. I'm just wondering if the officer can tell us, am I misreading that? Is this a scheme which has astonishingly few objections apart from CPRE? Have I missed something?
Yeah, I think so. There's been 155 objections, and you know, but
Sorry, can you point me to where they're mentioned in the report? I've obviously missed them.
It's about 229 supporters, if you read those that are in the papers. And you said 155, I thought it was 160 or something, but
I mean, it could be as much as that.
yeah.
So at the time of
But
draft,
that does include, I guess, supporters and objections to the previous.
I think it's page 5 of the agenda item. So it's basically the front, the first page of the report. Section 2, report summary. Representations have been received from approximately 155 third-party objectors and approximately 229 party supporters.
Okay, so the particular consultees are sort of given lots of space, including CPRE. Is everything else sort of brought together under the heading Other on pages 22 and 23, or am I missing a section about the residents' objections?
So page 18, section 8, publicity, and then if you go down publicity, it goes on, it provides a summary of the points raised by third parties.
Okay, I had somehow missed that. Okay, I will take a careful look at that. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay, if you can have a chew on those. Tony, Councillor Trotton, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, my question to the officer is the use of an additional array on the west side of the A4, which has been put to me that because of the reduction of acreage or the usage on the major field because of the escarpment issues, can you tell me, there doesn't seem to be anything here that would alleviate my feelings on the fact that that is on wetlands and also very close, in fact, right on the edge of the Wilton Barts Canal, which is being utilised by the volunteers who are allowing that stretch of land, waterway to be continued for sort of tourism. I'm surprised that that has been allowed on this particular application.
This area of land has always formed part of the application. It was always proposed as part of the scheme to have solar panels on that site. As you can see from the planting plan, there is actually quite a large boundary between the path of the canal and the actual positioning of the solar panels, and that area of land is to be left over to natural grassland and meadow. So there would actually be no building work on that area at all.
I suppose the question I'm asking is, I'm surprised that the Wilton Barts Canal hasn't made objection to it with the issues on the wetlands and the site of it along the historic canal. Did they not object?
Yes, they have not objected.
No objection.
They have asked for their access to be retained, haven't they? But,
Yes.
yeah. Adrian, Councillor Foster, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of questions. I have some advantage here, having lived at Derry Hill for 11 years and know the area quite well. If we look at the map that's on there at the moment, you've got the Forest Gate development that His Lordship put in for industrial use there. And yet in the report it mentions the 1 in 30 year flood risk here because of the, it's only level 1. But being a local, I am aware that there, at that particular point, it floods 2 or 3 times a year, not 1 in 30 years. Yet it's not mentioned in the report. And we have to have officers out there on a regular basis, either clearing the drains or signs put up for people to go over to the other side of the carriageway. And that, for that reason, I'm disappointed to see that there isn't a flood plan prior to coming to us. It's just in item 4 of the, which on page 44 of the report. it said no development shall commence on the site until a scheme for the discharge of surface water from the site. Now, that in itself only covers the present development, but there's an issue there already, and that needs to be addressed before we have more vehicles going into there. This is obviously going to add to that problem, not take away from it. So the fact there are no attenuation ponds being proposed here of any large scale and no drainage scheme in place before we actually approve this development is disappointing, to say the least. But the other smaller thing I had concerns about was the highway route for which the lorries would come here. That is the most appropriate route. My concern is how would that be enforced? Because large amounts of HGVs go straight through the centre of Chippenham just to save on fuel. And we have the same problem with policing speed limits. We have no policing. So if you could reassure me on both of those two aspects, that would be helpful.
With regards to the surface water flooding issues, I mean, obviously this application can only deal with what's on the site, and drainage details were supplied as part of the application and were considered by our drainage team in terms of the process of the application. Their conclusions were that, subject to condition, this can be acceptable, and they did identify that they felt that the applicants were missing the opportunity to include better drainage on the site through ponds and so forth. The proposal does actually include some ponds to be developed on the site, and to be honest with you, as this condition requires further detail to come forward as part of the application, there's no reason why those ponds potentially couldn't be used also for drainage, potentially.
So can you clarify why that wasn't addressed prior to coming to us here? Because this application has been going on for a couple of years. Not beyond the wit of man to have come up with a drainage scheme before bringing it to us.
The applicants did come forward with a drainage scheme, and it was at the request of our drainage officers. They were seeking further detail and so forth. Further detail was supplied, and to be honest with you, it's right at the end when we were looking towards making a decision on the application, but the drainage officer then identified that the opportunity to provide additional drainage through, for example, the provision of ponds, etc. It was a shame that was missed and not as part of the application. But like I said, through the imposition of this condition, it's still something that we can capture later on down the line. In terms of the construction traffic route, this can be captured in a traffic management plan, and undoubtedly I'm sure that the applicants will encourage their drivers to use the appropriate routes, but I agree with you, it will be difficult to enforce against in terms of if drivers take an alternative route. But I would imagine, in my opinion, it would be easier to drive around the A roads as opposed to trying to drive through Chippenham, having driven through Chippenham myself a number of times in the car. And I don't think it's necessarily the easiest and most straightforward route to go through.
Tony, do you want to come back? Thank you.
Yes, if I may. I was going to ask the question until that came up during the Rory's presentation on the access to the sites. Now, if you look at our presentation, before I came here today, there is no sign around the red line exactly where that was going to be. Yeah, now I see it on the right-hand side of our things there. It's just a sketch. You know, I'm quite surprised because you've got the right-hand side of the main PV array just put in, and then presumably the other one on the left-hand side is the one into perhaps that smaller array. It is, yeah. Why isn't that detailed on the red line around the site? It just shows a hedge all the way around. I would have thought, being a full application, that would have been explored. Although it's on a straight road, it's 40 miles an hour, I know. It's a very busy road. But in fact, I would have thought there would have been more attention to the splays and the, you know, before you actually get to either side of that. I was disappointed with the sketch map that I see there and the lack of where the entrance is going to be on our normal presentation. You know, the proposed layout just shows a hedge line, and even on the page 7, it it shows a yellow line around it, but nowhere do I see a safe entrance and exit for the larger vehicles that are going to come to do that. Can I presume that the Highways Office doesn't really sort of mention anything on there other than one of the points, there is an access to it. I was really surprised, being a full application, there wasn't a little bit more detail to that, to make sure it was safe.
Yeah, the application is quite a comprehensive application, contains a lot of detail, so I think we can all be forgiven if we miss something within it. It does actually contain details of the access points, identifying how lorries can actually enter and exit the site. They've actually been drawn on to show that the turning points into these accesses is feasible for large vehicles that will be delivering the units onto the site. Whilst I appreciate that maybe these plans don't do the access points justice in this presentation, at the right scale, they are actually to scale and do show the appropriate visibility in either direction, and that these are capable of receiving and offsetting lorries and other vehicles into and out of the site. So it's we do actually have the detail on the application. It is there. It does form part of the approved documents.
Okay, I'll accept that, thank you.
Hang on just a minute, Adrian. Christopher, you wanted to come back?
Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor
Yes,
Newby.
well, thank you to the officer. I have now managed to find all of the analysis of the residents' objections. As far as I can make out, Core Policy 42 accepts this kind of development in principle, subject to the 8 bullet points that are there. The landscape impacts have been dealt with by CPRE, and we can look at that in the debate. The residential amenity, point 7. I notice that there are about 20 or so houses that appear to be on the plan that are quite very close to this land. Could the officer tell us what are the representations from those near neighbours? Are they almost all objecting, or are they mostly supporting, or what is the balance of the representations from the people who are actually going to be the ones with the residential amenity impacts?
Without doing an in-depth analysis of all the comments that I've received in terms of objecting and identifying those against those addresses that lie along the A4 in that particular location, I couldn't say with hand on heart and guarantee that they are all objecting or if there is any support in amongst that. What I can say is that my understanding is, reading the objections that I have received, I have seen numerous objections from residents who live opposite the site and are objecting to the scheme in terms of the impact upon them, and including the impact upon the landscape and impact upon heritage. So, I'm very much aware that local residents who live the closest along the A4 there are objecting, and I would probably hazard a guess that a majority of them possibly are objecting, but I couldn't hand on heart say that they are all objecting.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Chair. And could I just try one further question? The way policy CP 42 is worded, it seems to me that the objections are much more relevant to our decision than the support, because the policy is supportive of renewable energy projects subject to satisfactory compliance with the 8 bullet points. And am I right that really we need to focus on the objections and whether they're valid or not? I mean, the idea that there are huge benefits from this scheme, which there may or may not be, is surely not part of the correct planning balance here, is it?
I would argue that it is part of the correct planning balance. You have to take into consideration the public benefits, that is the development of the scheme which will provide renewable energy, but the policy it relates to, that assessment does identify that residential amenity is an important aspect of the scheme being compliant with our policy. So yes, I would agree that the objectors are going to be highlighting the potential for impact upon their residential amenity as the ones who live closest to the site are likely to be most affected by.
Chairman, forgive me pursuing that a little bit further, but the NPPF says that this is down to the development plan. The development plan, its compliance with the development plan. Our own development plan has policy CP42 in it, but I don't see anything in there that says that I don't see anything in policy CP42. Maybe the officer can tell me where else it is in the development plan that says that even if there isn't compliance with the, even if there is demonstrable harm, you have to balance some theoretical climate benefits against it. Is that anywhere in our planning policies? Can you point to where it is, if it is there?
Top of my head, I can't point to it right now. I do take.
So I
on
don't
board-
think it is there, is it?
I do take on board what you're saying. I would have to double check.
Fair enough. We'll wait to hear later.
Yeah, that's a fair point. In the interest of fairness, I will point out that some of the supporters do live locally too. So we have had representations from those that live local that are in support. So it's only fair, in the interest of fairness, I point that out.
Well, absolutely, and the two parish councils are supporting. I see that, Chairman.
Yeah.
But on my analysis, it's the objections that we should be focusing on, whether they demonstrate that this doesn't comply with our corporate. Anyway, I'm starting to debate the issue, so I'll.
Yeah, we'll no doubt there'll be teased out. It'll also be interested to hear what the speakers have to say as well in due course. Some of that will be teased out. Thank you for raising the point. Councillor Foster, Adrian.
Thank you, Howard. I just want to follow up on Councillor Trotman's point about the traffic measure, which I brought up earlier. As I say, having lived here, and I'm conscious of the area, I am aware that this is quite a high accident point area, especially at the junction of the Devizes Road. And obviously further up at Studley Crossroads, there's been 1 or 2 deaths there recently. So it's not devoid of its traffic issues. So it's interesting that it hasn't been developed further. Is there anything the officer quite rightly mentioned, there has been a traffic plan that's in detail. How are they addressing turning right out of that particular development? Because that's going to be an interesting concept, turning right out of that field onto a very, very busy A4 where we've had, because of the Lasleyans, which is now called the Pewsham, several accidents with traffic trying to turn right there and other traffic not being as patient as they might otherwise be. And a lorry, that's only with cars involved. With a lorry involved, we could end up with some quite serious accidents here. If they were to turn left out of there, they have a long way to go all the way to Calne before they get to a roundabout that they can actually turn around and come back down the A4. And it does mean we're increasing the traffic at Studley Crossroads, which is not something to be advised.
I think what members need to remember is the construction phase will be for a temporary period and a relatively short one in the lifespan of the whole scheme in any event. In these types of circumstances, it would not be unusual to find when large vehicles are accessing or exiting such access points that banksmen would be involved in terms of making sure that vehicles exit in a safe manner and also to help calm traffic to allow vehicles to safely do their manoeuvres as well.
I take your point, but when Silverwood was built at Roud, and the plan for that came to this meeting not that long ago, part of the application addressed this turning right onto a main road, and this is the A420 is the same main road that we're adjacent to this. And it was agreed in the application that part-time traffic lights would be put in, which have been functioning well, but there's no proposal for that here. And this is a busier road than that.
To give you an accurate answer, I would need to double check the detail in relation to that specific point, but like I said, some sort of traffic calming measure would not be unusual, I would imagine, in these circumstances.
Yes, good point, Adrian. Thank you for that. Sarah, did I see your hand up? No, I was imagining it. In which case, then, I'm going to go to our first speaker. Got no other hands waving. So I'm going to go, please, to Janine Willard, please. You can speak from there if you like.
I'll stay here, thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name's Janine Willard. You hear me okay?
Yes, we've received your email too, thank you.
There have been frequent references to climate change and a climate emergency from supporters of this development because Wiltshire Council declared a climate emergency in 2019. Some supporters have simply written in to say this is a good idea. This is not a planning policy matter and is not relevant to the purposes of determining planning applications of this nature. The solar farm is an inappropriate development in this location and can only be described as industrial. This application will significantly adversely impact the character and appearance of the landscape. The expansive, tranquil landscape of open green fields with far-reaching views will turn into an industrial utility power grade complex with 170 acres of dominating solar panels, shipping containers, security fencing and floodlighting. If this application did not have its so-called green credentials, it would automatically be refused permission in this location due to its industrialisation of farmland. The proposed screening from residential properties by tree planting will not be effective for decades, as the fields are at least 3 metres lower than the road, because of the elevated position of the mass of residential properties. Therefore, the screening measures as proposed in the planning application of this site are wholly inadequate and irrelevant. It is simply not the case that this vast industrial development can possibly enhance the natural environment in respect of biodiversity. Biodiversity already exists. It would be better to do nothing to this site other than farm it as nature intended. Given the extent of the proposed solar array on low-lying ground, this development will be highly visible across a large area and will lead to coalescence between Calne and Chippenham. These are not my words, but those of the council's own landscape officer in their first objection. There are in fact 18 listed properties which overlook the site, not just 6, as referred to in the agenda public pack. Some are only within 10 to 30 metres away from the development boundary. This is unheard of for any solar development. I quote from the agenda public pack, which acknowledges the proposals will cause harm. In fact, in this case, the public benefits of this development do not outweigh the substantial harm that will be caused to the heritage assets and the amenity of the entire surrounding area. The applicant publicly claims cheap electricity for the local community. In fact, there's no cheap electricity for anybody. The small amount of power produced will simply be fed into the national grid. We question the grading of the proposed development land, which is mostly 3B with an area of grade 2 within the centre. Regardless of this reference to borderline 3B land, the land has been used successfully for cereal crops for decades. Simply giving land a number does not mean it's unusable. It is predicted that we will need to produce 56% more food by 2050 due to increasing populations. We have not increased food production by 56% in the last 30 years. And if we continue to build on farmland, we will have no hope of achieving it in the next 30 years. The ongoing war in Ukraine and subsequent food shortages here in the UK is undeniable proof that we cannot continue to sacrifice any farmland. The development is not temporary. The proposed lease of the site would be for a period of 40 years with a decommission period of approximately 5 years, which is a considerable period of time. It is very unlikely the site will ever be returned to its current agricultural use due to contaminated runoff from the soil from degrading solar panels. Therefore, there is no merit to any claims that the development is temporary and can be reversed. In conclusion, I'm disappointed that Calne Without Parish Council, who supported this application, do not represent the majority of people in the area who are against this development. Please vote to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Appreciate that. Richard Batten, please. Do I have Richard Patten?
You do, Chair.
Thank you.
Not quite. I have two main concerns: risk management and cumulative impact on Wiltshire. The Council's stance on fire risk assessment is, and I quote, "The Dorset Wilts Fire and Rescue Service are not a statutory consultee and therefore is not incumbent on the local planning authority to consult with them on planning application. However, this is, we regard, an industrial power plant, generating and storing significant megawatts of electricity and therefore should be treated as an exceptional construction. As electrical installations degrade, the risk will increase. And we've all seen press reports related to lithium-ion fires and how they are difficult to extinguish. Let us remember the Sandridge solar farm fire that required a large number of fire crews being sent from nearby towns to deal with it. A rooftop solar panel fire in Bristol destroyed the top floor of a block of offices, and the Best Systems fire in Liverpool that burned for days. And of course, the one in Cambridgeshire, where toxic fumes meant nearby villages were at risk of being evacuated. The committee cannot ignore the fact that this installation is covering fields where there is an oil pipeline running across the site. This, along with electrical equipment, cables, batteries, etc., is a recipe for disaster. Too often, first responders are expected to deal with accidents and fires that were preventable and rely on full access to all parts of a site. We are now informed that the panels will be more condensed to compensate for the loss of fields in the original plan, thus hindering the access. According to the UK government, a number of serious fires deemed as uncontrollable have been occurred at solar farms in the UK to date. And the more farms there are, the more incidents there will be. I want to turn my attention to Wiltshire as a whole. A question I ask, when will Wiltshire have enough solar farms? Wiltshire has already surpassed its required number of solar farms, plants, to be supplied to the nation. In fact, Wiltshire's contribution currently stands at 167%, the highest in the southwest and the second highest in the UK. Another question, when will brownfield sites be used instead of farmland? It is unacceptable to select a site which is not close to an electricity substation and still requires planning approval to achieve its connectivity. And finally, when will commercial buildings and new residential builds be required to have solar panels? This would make a significant difference and negate the need to use essential crop growing farmland for solar developments. The committee is reminded of the application for 200 houses in this locality that was refused in 2017 because the size and location will be unacceptably harmful to the landscape and character of the rural area. And it would reduce the rural separation between settlements. And this latter point, a major issue regarding coalescence between Chippenham and Calne. Wiltshire is fast becoming a county that is storing up future problems of toxic waste disposal. Consideration must be given to preventing carbon emissions in the county and not indirectly helping countries like China to increase them through the use of coal-fired furnaces and power stations and the manufacture of these panels. Councils up and down the country recognise the need for food security. Between 2017 and 21, only 5 solar farms nationally were refused. However, from 2021 to date, 23 have been refused. The committee should now take a stance and refuse this application in order to safeguard essential farmland, such as that which has successfully produced cereal crops for decades and should be allowed to continue to do so. I ask the committee to do the right thing in this instance and refuse the application. Enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And David Price, please.
Thank you. Currently, 4 countries make up 55% of global emissions, China being nearly 30% of this. And as for the UK, just 1%. This puts into perspective where climate issues really lie. The panels being used in this project will come from China, the heaviest polluting country on the planet, where their production involves the melting of silicon rock at 1400 degrees using furnaces powered by fossil fuel, coal. This equates to nearly 4 tons of coal per panel. This proposal consists of over 83,000 panels, so that's over 332,000 tons of coal needed. Also, be aware, each panel has caustic chemicals such as sodium hydroxide and hydrofluoric acid. I highlight this because at the end of their life, such toxic elements make this very difficult to recycle, and as such, landfill is the preferred option. The International Renewable Energy Agency announced there is a crisis on solar waste going to landfill, and their report states 78 million tons of solar panels will end up in landfill by 2050. It's also worth noting the figure of 49.9 megawatts is the ISO rating of the solar panels. This is not the actual generated power. In the south of the UK, the performance of solar panels is in the region of 15 to 20% efficiency, and it degrades each year by 1%, meaning in 25 years, when solar panels are coming to the end of their life, this farm will not be offsetting carbon emissions as we're led to believe, and will be next to useless. So there is a large carbon footprint in the manufacturing, transportation, installation, decommissioning and disposal. To say the panels will offset the carbon footprint of manufacturing in the 40 years lifetime is simply not true. Surely it's hypocritical to say such power stations are necessary to combat global warming when, in fact, the process does the exact opposite. To say the power plant will provide electricity for over 13,000 homes may be true, but not necessarily in Wiltshire. To say it will offset 20,000 tonnes of gas emissions is questionable given their inefficiency. I fail, therefore, to understand how this solar farm, or what it actually is, a power plant, and any of these other plants across Wiltshire will contribute to achieving the target of zero emissions. If China goes on manufacturing panels and producing carbon emissions at the rate they do without any regard for global warming, the climate situation will get worse, especially when they are doing heavy manufacturing of our so-called green products. To link solar to combating climate change, in many people's opinions, is not substantiated, nor do we have any quantifiable evidence that they're making a difference. It is incumbent on the planning committee not to allow the construction of a power plant that will be detrimental to the locals and the historic landscape on which this plant will sit. This isn't an installation in the middle of nowhere, it's in the heart of a community. I accept what I've said may be deemed not relevant to the planning process. Nevertheless, this is an application to have an industrialised power plant built next to some 38 properties, many of which were listed, and to be built upon countryside that acts as a break between Chippenham and Carn, with no evidence it will actually reduce climate change. The plant is too big, too dangerous, and not substantiated. Simply put, this is solely an application to develop rural land into an industrial business for those involved to profit from it. Does the council have any evidence to show how efficient the existing Wiltshire farms have been and how they're helping towards net zero targets? If not, how can this application be approved on the grounds it will make a contribution to combating global warming or benefit those affected by it? How can we feel good about doing our bit when we are importing carbon from China? Reducing our already very small carbon footprint by increasing other countries at an accelerated rate is not combating climate change. And I, for one, cannot live in ignorant bliss or turn a blind eye to this fact. I ask you all to consider to do the same. Please don't destroy this area of outstanding natural beauty. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Harry Lopes, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Harry Lopez, the founder of Eden Renewables. The business and I are both based in Wiltshire. We have worked hard with your planning officer, statutory consultees, and consulted extensively with the local community to produce a scheme which complies with planning policy. Our expert planning lawyer at DAC Beechcroft has confirmed all steps of the council's process have been properly followed. The NPPF is clear that local planning authorities should approve applications for renewable energy projects if impacts are or can be made acceptable. It also states that applicants do not need to demonstrate the need for more renewable energy at a local level. This is because of the difficulty of reaching our national targets. The Wiltshire Core Strategy Policy 422 also does not place a cap on the number of renewable energy installations. There are no objections from statutory consultees, and the parish council supports the project. Councils, while many public comments have been submitted expressing views on both sides, lots of duplicates. The number of individual supporters is much higher at 229 than the 157 against. We have responded to feedback, increasing screening along the A4 with a 30-metre wide belt of native woodland, hedgerows and scrub. We have reduced the size of the solar farm by 20% with minimal impact on generation capacity and reduced the panel heights by 14%. The key requirement for any solar farm is a grid connection, which we secured in 2019. The grid in Wiltshire is now full until the mid-2030s. No new renewable projects without grid connections can be deployed until then. Regen, the non-profit energy experts, highlighted this problem in its recent report on Wiltshire's renewable electricity progress, stating that large-scale solar is the only viable way to deliver significant new renewable generation capacity here by 2030. The site is almost completely Grade 3B, not best and most versatile land. Government policy is very clear that this is acceptable for solar development, with Therese Coffey at DEFRA and Grant Shapps at Bayes both issuing recent statements. Much of the site is wet, hard to farm productively, mostly used for hay cutting, and where it has been used for arable in the past, requires high levels of expensive chemical inputs. Hard land to farm historically, probably impossible in the new uncertain world of heavily reduced subsidies. The National Farmers Union supports the project, recognising the broad benefits of solar farms for maintaining a viable, sustainable agriculture sector. The site is not visible from the Derry Hill Conservation Area, and while 4 Grade 2 listed buildings are identified as having the lowest possible level of harm to their settings, one is buffered by the business park and the others are separated from the site by the busy A4 London Road and the new woodland planting, and must also be seen in the context of other modern features nearby, such as the car sales showroom and business park. The Wilts and Berks Canal Trust will continue to have access for its ongoing restoration and has no objection to the plans. The batteries will be located well away from any residences and comply with stringent health and safety requirements. We have consulted Dorset and Wiltshire Fire Service. Batteries are considered safe to install even in urban areas. There is a large battery system at Mannington in Swindon and numerous in Manhattan. The government's energy security strategy requires a 5-fold increase in solar by 2035. The recent net zero review by Conservative MP Chris Skidmore reiterates this target, going even further, calling for a solar revolution. Wiltshire has a 2030 net zero target, but still meets only 6% of its energy demand from renewables. Time is running out, and we really need projects like Forest Gate to make some progress. Solar costs a fraction of nuclear and gas, is quick to build, does not pollute, and reduces energy costs for everyone. Per the SSE Connection Register, this project represents about 1/5 of all the renewable electricity generation that could possibly be connected by 2030. This is only a tiny fraction of the way to net zero targets. The panels we use are inert, will produce 80% of their power in 35 years, and are now nearly fully recyclable. Eden fully intends to build and operate the solar farm for the long term. We're particularly excited to share the ownership of the project with the local community through the new Community Benefit Society, Zero North Wiltshire, which has been set up for this purpose and which expects to distribute millions more to local social and environmental causes as a result. Your officer's report identifies significant environmental, public and economic benefits that outweigh the very limited harm identified and recommends approval of this application. We hope that members will support this recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. Jim Cook, please.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
My name is Jim Cook. I'm just reiterating that. And I've lived in a Grade 2 listed building at Knockett's Farm on the hill above Old Derry Hill for 30 years. So I'm a local. And from our dining room window, we are blessed with sweeping panoramic vistas over North Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. And we also have one of only a handful of uninterrupted views of the whole site that you're considering today. I won't discuss the contribution to renewable energy and tackling climate change, as I hope that's blindingly obvious. And I don't want to talk to you either about planning law. You have many experts for that. Instead, I want to present the views of the local residents that are passionately in favor of the solar farm. And I'm going to focus on 3 key points: the land, the broader impacts on habitat, and of course, the views. Firstly, the land. 95% of the land concerned is Grade 3B, and I can't recall anything other than grass ever being harvested from this area. Leaving the land to rest will allow it to continue to sequester carbon with no extra emissions from the heavy use of artificial fertilizer. And left to its own devices, the soil will improve in every aspect. In particular, the soil microbiome will return to its natural state, and with the absence of heavy machinery, soil composition will recover its natural porosity, further enhancing soil biodiversity. And of course, the land can be completely restored to its former use when the solar farm comes to the end of its life. And as several have pointed out, it's interesting to note that the National Farmers Union supports the proposal. Turning to the broader impacts on habitat, the Diversity Management Plan presents a range of programs that are predicted to significantly enhance the habitat. From a natural habitat perspective, almost every aspect of the site will improve, whether it's vegetation, the soil, bird and animal sustainability, or most importantly, support for our catastrophically declining insect population. But let's consider what might be the most contentious issue: the impact of the site on our views. Yes, I'd rather continue to look out on fields, but in the face of a looming climate catastrophe, what could I say to my grandchildren were they to ask me in 20 years' time, why did you oppose the solar farm just because it disrupted your views of North Wiltshire. In fact, I believe I'll come to enjoy looking out on rows of photovoltaic panels silently generating the electricity I need to drive my electric car. Finally, I'd like to thank the experts in Wiltshire Council for preparing such a comprehensive report on the application, summarising the views of the various protagonists and antagonists. But reading the report, it's clear that the benefits far outweigh the impacts. And I hope the committee today will agree with the report's recommendation and grant full planning permission.
Thank you, Jim. And Peter Copener, please.
Thank you. My name's Peter Capener. I'm director and co-founder of Bath & West Community Energy. BWC is a successful member-led community energy organisation delivering renewable energy and innovative energy demand projects on a not-for-profit basis, working across Bath and the surrounding area, including the western part of Wiltshire. Since we were set up in 2010, we've grown one of the largest community energy portfolios in the country, and our vision is for an energy system where local people can buy low-cost, clean energy direct from local community-owned projects. We've raised nearly 12 million through community finance to build multiple rooftop and ground mount solar projects. Income from these projects have enabled us to donate £330,000 to date and will provide around 8 million over their lifetime to support community action on carbon reduction and fuel poverty across our area. We're now working with local community group Zero Chippenham to bring similar benefits to North Wiltshire through shared ownership of Forest Gate Solar Farm. We've been installing solar on every viable roof that comes forward, but if we're to get to net zero, we need larger grid-connected projects like this one. Delivering government solar targets will only use 0.5% of farmland across UK, roughly half the space taken up by golf courses currently. And Forest Gate Solar Farm brings significant benefits, including the opportunity to take 20% of the project into community ownership. Whilst only estimates at this stage, we're confident that our not-for-profit community model will enable us to offer up to £50,000 per year from just the community-owned element of the project, subject to performance. This will grow significantly after 15 years when debt's been repaid, and over the project's life, the community's 20% alone could generate over 5 million that can be retained within the local area. This is many times more than Eden's previous community benefit contribution for the whole site. But not only that, local people can also invest in the solar farm, earn a reasonable return and increase local control. With Zero Chippenham, we're supporting the setting up of a new community organisation, Zero North Wiltshire, to spread the benefits of community-owned energy throughout the area. Through membership of BWC and Zero North Wilts, local people will be able to get directly involved in this and other projects developed in the area. We're excited by the prospect of being able to support a new community energy organisation for North Wiltshire, but we're also delighted by the opportunity to work with Eden Renewables, a commercial organisation that has impressed us historically with their strong commitment to community partnership, their openness and transparency on the finances of this project in particular, and their track record of maximising biodiversity improvements across their solar sites. This is an opportunity for Wiltshire to host a genuinely pioneering and exciting community commercial partnership. Across our area, the local electricity grid is heavily constrained, as mentioned, and we've recently been told that we must wait till 2036 for projects above 1 megawatt to be connected, like most developers, community or otherwise in this area. As a result, projects like Forest Gate, which already have a grid connection confirmed, become vitally important. These projects must be built if we're serious about net zero and stand any chance of hitting our 2030 goals for carbon reduction. I do hope members will approve this application and the significant community benefits that it'll bring. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to turn now to a Calne without Parish Council, please. Councillor John Barnes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the meeting. And I'd also like to thank the officers for their time and efforts in producing a very comprehensive report. So my name is John Barnes. I'm the Parish Councillor for Pewsham Ward of Calne Without, where the scheme is located. I live in Old Derry Hill. I overlook the proposed site, and I'm also here today speaking as the representative of Calne Without Parish Council, where I am the Vice Chair. So I was elected to the Parish Council in May 2021 in kind of one of those rare things, a contested Parish Council election, and even rarer for a single-seat ward. The proposed solar farm was obviously the key local issue. My opponent made it very clear that he was opposed to the solar farm, and I was very clear in my literature that I supported it. In the event, I was elected with 58% of the vote. So I can therefore, I think, claim to have a democratic mandate to be here speaking today in support of the scheme. In July 2021, following the submission of the original planning application, Calne Without Parish Council held a public meeting to consider our position on the scheme. The meeting was packed. We listened to views of local residents, both in support of and in opposition to the proposed solar farm. It is controversial. Having carefully considered all the views expressed, our parish council voted to support the scheme by 9 votes to 3 with 1 abstention, and we continue to support the scheme. So why am I and why is the parish council supporting it? The overriding reason has to be climate change. The evidence of this is beyond doubt. Since 1900, global average temperature has increased by 1 degree centigrade, and if emissions continue on their present trajectory, then further warming of 2.6 to 4.8 degrees will be expected this century. We are seeing the impact of climate change, such as the loss of Arctic sea ice and more frequent extreme weather events. We're also facing global tipping points, such as the thawing of Arctic Circle permafrost, that will accelerate the process. And locally, closer to home, we're seeing impacts through more frequent extreme droughts. We've just had our driest February in 30 years. We understand the science that's driving behind climate change, and we also know what we need to do. We need to transition our economy away from its dependency on fossil fuels, and that has to start with how we generate our energy. But there are other reasons to support the application. There are significant improvements in biodiversity, with wildflower meadows, new hedgerows, almost 10,000 new trees, bird and bat boxes, ponds, scrapes, and hibernacula, giving a net biodiversity gain. Locally, we'll have improved access with a footpath around the site, a community benefit fund, an educational fund for local schools, and a really good opportunity for community investment. The solar farm has the potential to become a great asset for the local community. In planning terms, the application meets core policy 42 of the Wiltshire Plan, and locally it conforms to our own neighbourhood plan. It's now almost 20 months since the parish council voted to support the scheme. Over the past year, we've seen our vulnerability to fossil fuel dependency. The invasion of Ukraine has caused huge escalations in energy prices worldwide, and at home it's created a cost of living crisis. We need to transition to homegrown, cost-effective, renewable energy sources, not just because it's the right thing to do for the environment, but also because energy security is crucial for the long-term prosperity of our country. Locally, this is a controversial scheme. People are often resistant to change in the countryside. Many of my neighbours object to the scheme. Many others support it. Eden Renewables have made considerable effort to consult the local community. They've amended their plans to mitigate concerns as far as practical and are screening the development with a 30-metre wide belt of woodland next to the A4. The scheme will provide renewable energy to power almost 14,000 homes and will save an estimated 20,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum, making a significant contribution to national and local targets. I urge you to grant it planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor John Barnes. And finally, to our unitary member, Ashley O'Neill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask if you can hear me? Because I always get accused of not speaking properly in the chamber. So I want to make sure that you can all hear what I'm saying. And if you can, I tend to mumble. So please do say something. Don't sit there and not be able to hear me. Mr. Chairman, before I talk about the actual application itself, I just want to make an apology to the committee, if I may, please, that you're all here today at this extraordinary meeting. It wasn't my request that the item was deferred from the previous agenda, although I understand that you were here some 6 hours, actually, last week, so maybe it wasn't a bad thing that it ended up being deferred, as we know we don't make good decisions when we've been sat in meetings for 6 hours. And the reason I asked for the deferral is because the planning department had not told me that it was coming to committee. I actually found out from residents on the day that the agenda was due to be published. And I think with an application like this, it's so important with the scale of it that you give as much notice as possible so that everybody has the opportunity to participate if they want to. That is a fundamental part of democracy. So whilst I apologise, I make no mistake for what I asked for. In the 6 years that I've been a member, I can certainly say I've never had an issue before of being told about a planning application that's coming to committee. I've always found planning to be absolutely excellent in keeping us informed when applications are going to committee in our divisions. And the Constitution even talks about that need to inform division members of such matters. And whilst he's not here today, I just sort of would make the point to the head of development management, who I believe is Andrew Guest, that maybe there's a sort of a reflection required on the internal processes and how we came to a situation that a division member was not informed about such an important application coming to committee. So I think I'll probably leave my comments on that there if I may. On the application itself, committee members, you'll be very pleased to know that I'm not going to subject you to a 30-minute speech. I think you've heard very clearly the impassioned speeches from around the chamber, and I won't go over the points again. I think for me the key issues here for the committee to consider, and that they'll be of no surprise to you, the landscape and the visual impact. I think that is undeniable here. Nobody disputes that. That is a relevant factor, especially due to the close proximity to a residential setting and considering the topology of the area. So we mustn't pretend that it won't be seen. Of course it will be. Then we've heard reference to obviously the coalescence between Chippenham and Derry Hill, which the landscape officer did raise in initial comments. I did have a look at the sort of consultee responses. They don't feature later on. I'm not quite sure why that is. That seems a bit odd, as I don't think that you can resolve the issue of coalescence. Either it exists or it doesn't. And it doesn't really matter what you do to the site, you can't address that element. And then, of course, there is that harm to the heritage assets, which doesn't matter what you do, it does exist, regardless of the scale that it is on, which, of course, is made even more significant by having those panels on both sides of the A4. But ultimately, of course, that has all got to be weighed up against the arguments of the public benefit that you as a committee will need to assess. I think it's definitely fair to say that there are a significant number of people on both sides of this debate. You can sort of hear that today from those that are speaking in support or opposition. Parish Council has supported the application, although I think on the most recent vote, on the most recent consultation, if that makes sense, I think it was a little bit closer. I'm not quite sure why those numbers potentially changed. And then, of course, you've got local residents objecting, supporting, and those most impacted, ultimately, some of which are here today. I just wanted to address something that I heard in the technical questions and that the case officer responded to, and that was about, I think it was Councillor Newbury, you raised the point about where the support and the objections had come from. I was sent the more detailed consultation data just to sort of help me understand what was the feeling of the local community. And having had a quick scroll through it, it's not been a particularly scientific exercise. My assessment is that generally the supporters come from sort of a wider geographic area, within North Wiltshire, and the objectors come from a more localised area, which is not a great surprise. That's something that you would expect to see, but hopefully that just gives you a bit of colour to that. But I guess I just simply want to say that you are the experienced planning committee members. I trust that you today will take everything into consideration that you've heard and will make a good decision. And irrespective of what the outcome is, I do hope that we have a robust and forensic debate that I look forward to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ashley-O'Neill. Appreciate that. Before I go to debate, I'm just going to invite you, Jonathan, if there's anything you wanted to come back on. There's a number of issues been raised. You're okay? Okay, that's fine. Si, as you're sitting there, is there anything you wanted to add, contribute to this? You don't feel pressurised.
Only in so much as that there was a question asked by Councillor Newbury about if I understand the question correctly, about how you interpret core policy 42. If you do read the opening gambit of the policy, it's a welcome policy. So it's basically saying
these types of applications will be supported. And then it goes on to list criteria that should be assessed. Sorry, is it not coming through? Sorry. Back in space. Yes, so it's a welcome policy. It's inviting you to have a starting position of supporting these types of applications. And that is somewhat reflected in the MPPF. On page 25 of your report, the relevant paragraphs from the MPPF are rehearsed. So it's basically suggesting to you that the need for these things and how these things operate and the contribution they make, that should be taken as a given. So I would very much say that the starting point is that you support these things and then you go on to consider the impacts and whether you find those impacts acceptable and whether you can mitigate them to such a degree to make them acceptable.
Councillor Newbury, I'm going to invite you to come back on that if you wish.
I wonder if I might, Chairman. I mean, that's not the actual wording of Court Policy 42, is it? Which says proposals will need to demonstrate how impacts on the following factors have been satisfactorily assessed. So I think to say that the policy begins by supporting such proposals, I mean, it's a matter of whether the glass is half full or half empty, perhaps, but it is perfectly clear that there needs to be a satisfactory demonstration that these things are in other words, if there's harm, and that provides a reason for refusal. That's the first thing I want to say, Chairman. I didn't hear anything to support the idea that we then had to have a balancing exercise with the benefits to be observed from renewable energy generation. I didn't hear anything. And I've myself, on other occasions, I've looked at our planning policies and found nothing like that in them. Chairman, there's something else I'd like to say before we get into the debate, and that is that during the meeting, a little alarm bell started to flash in my head that we weren't being told who the owner of the land was, and I thought I'd check the application form. And having looked at that, the Certificate B section says that the owners of the land are Wiltshire Council and the Marquis of Lansdowne. Now, Lord Lansdowne is a friend of mine. I'm a member of Wiltshire Council, so I think I would just like it to be recorded in the minutes under declarations of interest that I think, and I would be interested to hear from officers why the report, I mean, if this is an application on behalf of Wiltshire Council as the owner of the land, that would normally be something that would bring it to committee anyway without the local member having to call it in, isn't it? So, I mean, are officers aware that we have an ownership interest in the land, and should they not have reported that to us?
I don't think we have of this piece. I think that's the piece that's been withdrawn, but I'll just clarify that.
Yes, we are not an applicant on the application.
No, we're not an applicant, but are we an owner? Because the application form says that we are.
You did just mention, are we an applicant on the application, and we're not. I'm just confirming that. And with regards to owners, I would imagine it's probably to do with highway verge, that's where visibility displays, etc., will cross the land in those locations where we would be notified of an application such as this.
Okay, fair enough, Chairman. Well, I don't feel I have any sort of pecuniary interest in this, but I will accept the answer that it's only highway verge. So in that case, the issue is that it seems to belong to Lord Lansdowne, which, as I say, if it could be minuted that he's a friend of mine, I would then withdraw if I was planning to support this, because I wouldn't want to be voting for the application of a friend. But as I'm now going to speak against this, I think I'm not feeling that I need to withdraw. It seems to me that there is plenty of demonstrable harm, Chairman. We have the CPRE setting it out exactly how they see the landscape harm of this. We have a number of residents, some of whom have spoken to us quite convincingly about the harms that they will themselves suffer. As I read policy CP42, it's simply a question of, is this acceptable in policy terms? It has there been sufficient demonstration that these points have been covered, that there are no demonstrable harms? And as I see it, there's plenty of harm here. I'm not, as you know, Chairman, I'm not one of those who believes that the need for wind farms and solar panels is so compelling because of the climate crisis. I rather agreed with the third speaker, I didn't catch his name, the third speaker in the open forum who was giving us an analysis of whether a solar farm of this nature in this location would in fact have a positive or negative carbon footprint. And I'm more or less persuaded by other cases that it's probably negative rather than positive. But in any event, when it comes to energy
But you're withdrawing from the debate anyway, are you?
Yeah, I'm having my say now, Chairman, because I don't want to come back later. I'm in a hurry to get away for a medical appointment, so I will shut up there.
All right. So I think we're going to leave it there. I'm going to invite then somebody to come forward with a proposal, please. Tony, Councillor Trotman.
Yes, thank you. And listening to Councillor Newbury, I have similar involvement, I suppose. I'm a local person. I was brought up in Studley in teenage years, but lived in Carn all my life. And I've driven past this road thousands of times, as you probably all know. This is a difficult one because as we all have to respect that Wiltshire Council is striving to be carbon neutral by 2030, we, as a strategic plan, have been throughout this county, especially in the north area, placing solar arrays for the benefit of the community as well as all of the incidences with the utilities. But we have to look at each of these plans in isolation, and that's exactly how I feel about this one. I would normally support these arrays if they work within our planning policies, but I have a real concern about this one. This one is right on the main road. If you're travelling from Chippenham towards Calne, it's on your left. There's an escarpment. It's a green escarpment right up to towards Bremhill. I can't remember the actual village just up on the top there, a small hamlet, and of course the back of Studley. We and those people that live there must have a visual effect of that green landscape, which is absolutely brilliant. If you were actually walking across the road and just looking up, it is part of Wiltshire's green landscape. The fact it's owned by Bowood Estate doesn't worry me. We have dealt with Lord Lansdowne in many planning applications. I believe that Forest Gate, the industrial or offices, belong to him, which have a listed nature to that, of which case part of this will affect the listed buildings. So I'm going to consider objecting on the 3 or even 4 core policies that we use in planning to mitigate any of the incidences. First of all, core policy 51, which is the landscape, and I've talked about that now. The landscape is gradient. It goes up towards the top of Derry Hill. It is visible, and this PV array will certainly obstruct that wonderful view that we have. Core policy 51 is, I would cite paragraph 1, 2, 5, and 6. That's in Roman numerals, of course, 1, 2, V and V1. The other one, which we've used in many planning applications, which is relevant in this case, is core policy 57, which is the high quality design and place shaping. So although I have supported PV arrays all over the parts of the county that we live in for a particular reason, this one right on the side of the road visibly will affect the housing along that route and also those that drive past. And I would use core policy 1, 2, and 6. And I can quote each of those paragraphs if you wish. And the other one is core policy 58, which is conserving the historic landscape. And although there's no archaeological inference to that, it is a historical landscape. That landscape has been there all my life. That field there, which is used for possible grazing or hay cutting, is relevant to our village areas, especially Calne without parish council, Pewsham, Chippenham and Calne, so core policy 58. There is one item which I hadn't really thought about until later, but that's the core policy 50, which is biodiversity. Local people that know this area and know Bow Wood know that there's, during the rutting season, the roe deers all come across that field, across the Pewsham A4, I will admit, into the Bow Wood land. And that is quite significant to me. And I think the disturbance that this will occur is very relevant at this point. So I know it's not everybody's wish to, but I believe that we have good objection on this particular plan in isolation to others that it doesn't accord with the policies that I've quoted, and ask for a seconder.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Chairman.
So we have a proposal and a seconder. No, Sarah, yes, Councillor Gibson. You can speak to them. Yeah.
I understand fully Councillor Trotman's concerns, and I appreciate the public that have spoken, and I understand that if you are living close to this, then the change of the environment in the short term will be dramatic until a lot of this green landscaping comes into effect, and none of us like change. And I can see that one would justifiably be concerned if you were an immediate neighbour of something like this. Having been an immediate neighbour of a solar farm in the past, I can remember the first days of seeing it and being quite horrified, until 2 years had gone past and the vegetation had started to grow up, and actually you start to realise how much more biodiversity you get from a solar farm than you do from a ploughed or even constantly mowed grazing field, and there is nothing natural about agricultural land. It may have been around for a long time, nearly as long as Councillor Trotman, as he mentioned that he is historic, but there, the ability of land to recover under these things, and it is only for a relatively, in land terms, short period of time. So although I appreciate the concerns, I don't think I can support my colleague on this one. If you look back at Core Policy 42, which is the most important part of this application, it does say schemes will be supported subject to satisfactory resolution of all site-specific constraints. In which case,
Hang on a minute. Councillors, I thought one of you was withdrawing from the debate. Can we just listen to what Councillor Gibson is saying, please? Sorry.
oh, sorry, I just thought if there was something else that you wanted to add, I was quite happy to
No, we might
stop.
come back to
Okay.
that.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that I lost my train of thought. If you look back at Core Policy 42, the majority of the points on there are not relevant or not applicable to this site. The clear problem here is residential amenity. And so we are looking at how much does this site actually affect the residential amenity? Are we looking at something where these dwellings are clearly prejudiced by the situation? And I think given that they are the other side of the road, and it is a main road, and there is a sizable piece of land left between them, there is mitigation in terms of the landscaping. I find it hard to believe that we're going to be able to justify that residential amenity is seriously affected. So unfortunately, I don't think I can support you, Tony, on this one.
Okay, thank you for that. Did you want to come back on that, Tony? Councillor Trotman?
Yes, that's true. I was leaving Core Policy 42 out because that's part of the standalone renewable energy installation, of which we have dealt with in many places, in North Wiltshire as well as the county. But as my colleagues suggest, there is an item there which I would include, which is Core Policy 42, item 7, V11, resident amenity, including noise, odour, visual amenity and safety. It's the visual amenity from the houses along that side of A4, which is about the only one I could quote. The landscape, well, it says particularly in and around an AONB, but it isn't in that position. The only thing it does affect the landscape as well. So whether or not the officer would accept a core policy 42 item 1 at the same time. It does show biodiversity that I mentioned about the known deer run, which has been applicable over the last century, I believe, which is core policy 42.4, 1V. So I will put that in, but obviously the officer will have to consider how we deal with this one. And other colleagues haven't spoken
Yes, well, I'm
yet,
going to invite
so
the to come forward.
I may not.
It's an interesting point because with both Mindsea and Sevington, the one that they've done around there, visual impact became issues, but they were considered not to be considerable issues because of the lack of properties there, because of good screening and so on and so forth. It is unquestionably a much bigger issue here, and of course from a heritage asset as well. I personally have huge concerns over this. And I have to take issue with the highways. Personally, I had first-hand experience of, and I remember Councillor Ross Henning once saying, the only time we got a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit there was when we actually had a fatality, which was sad but true. And I came back from Christchurch only recently, came back that way, came down the hill to see quite an expensive Mercedes come out of the Pewsham there, the pub, straight into a Lexus or vice versa. I said to my wife, they're a few years old, but I said, well, that's at least £40,000 worth of damage done there. And it's a horrible place to have any kind of access or egress. And of course, I take the point of, I think it was Jim Cook and Councillor John Barnes being willing to look at the site from where they lived, but it would be much better if it was cucumbers, tomatoes, and all sorts of other things, particularly at the moment, I guess. So I'm certainly supporting the proposal. I will hand over to Jonathan to see if there's anything else you wanted to add to any of this.
And just on your last point there, you said you have issues with the highways. Are you suggesting that you might be looking...
No, I'm not adding it in because I don't think we can. But it's just local knowledge, as Tony has correctly pointed out. As you will very well know, I'm very often at odds with our highways officers, but I don't think I can on this one. Yeah, okay.
You made two comments. One of them is about tomatoes, which we all know this land is not capable of supporting.
It was
So
slightly
I'd just like to,
facetious,
I know, I
of course,
realise that, but I think it's important not to give the impression that if we don't put a solar farm on it, this piece of land is producing something other than hay, which it's not. So I take slight exception to the fact that we suggest that it's doing something else for reducing some of our energy consumption. It's not. And reducing energy is as equally as important as having tomatoes, which are out of season. So it isn't something that just because we think that it would be nice to have land for other purposes. This is not that land. This is 3B land. It isn't capable of doing any of those things. I think that is important in this case.
Chairman, could I just
Well, no, I
apologise
don't
to
think
Councillor Gibson on something?
I don't think I accept that, but yes, Christopher, sorry.
I just wanted to say sorry to Councillor Gibson that I was whispering to Councillor Trotman while she was speaking, that I was simply trying to draw his attention to bullet point 7 of Core Policy 42, because it struck me that if we didn't say anything about that, then we were effectively saying that this complies with Core Policy 42, and I think the applicants would be entitled to point that out. So I think it is wise, if we are going to refuse this, to include the bullet point about residential amenity, including noise, odour, visual amenity and safety. And one of the objectors in the open forum did raise the safety issue.
Thank you. But let's be very clear about this. As I've often said before, we've reflected. We have, generally speaking, 4 competing pressures on our land. Firstly, the government tells us we need to be building 300,000 houses a year. Secondly, as a trusty farmer in one of my villages reminded me recently, we need to be planting more trees. Thirdly, the war in Ukraine, I guess, has brought into sharp focus the need for sustainable energy, and that's why these sort of things come forward. And it's absolutely right and proper that we should be focusing on that. But fourthly, what it's also done is brought into sharp focus the need for producing our own food, given that 40% of it's imported. And the balancing act for all of us is to look at the best use of land, particularly given that we're not making any more of it. So I was kind of facetiously making the point that I think there could be use elsewhere. But I'm not going to, I didn't ask for that to be put into the debate or reasons for refusal, because it was just making a point. Adrian, Councillor Foster, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm afraid on this occasion I have to disagree with you and Councillor Trotman, given that the last application we saw for solar panels was at Lee Delamere, and the traffic route there was not by any means ideal. This is a major road which gives much better access. I mentioned earlier my concerns about a traffic management for this site, and those concerns still are there. But this land is nowhere near as good as the land at Lee Delamere, which was planted out. That was a wheat-growing land. It was brash. It had good drainage as well as good water retention because of the clay element of the brash, and was able to produce 1 in 4 years wheat crop of 10 tonnes to the acre, which is the aspiration of most agricultural people. And that was 3B as well. But this land, because of its inclination and the high clay there, and I know the land topography here and the land soil type, having lived there, is heavy clay. The good sand is on the top, and this is a spring line as well, which is what causes the water problems at the bottom. So I think the argument about loss for land for agriculture is very tenuous, because the best this can do is produce grass, which then produces beef, which is not the most environmentally friendly way of producing protein for human beings. And I'm a farmer of many years and educated in farming. But I also noticed that from page 36, the outline plan doesn't include the bit at the bottom of the junction at Derry Hill with the Devizes Road. And then if you see on this drawing here and all subsequent drawings, there is. And from reading this whole application from beginning to end yesterday, it's clear that the developer has taken on board all the concerns, the views, and tried to mitigate all the objections as much as they physically can. And this particular piece of land there, they propose planting trees. So I am convinced that from the discussions from both sides here, that the ecological advantage that this will give is a plus and not a minus. And so the 4 items you mentioned, 3 of them will be met. The only one that won't be met is we won't be having 300,000 houses on this site to meet the government's desires. All the others are being met. I've mentioned my concerns about this development, and I think they can be addressed if we put the correct amount of work into it. But Councillor Gibson mentioned at the last application for solar panels, this is 6 months of pain for 40 years of gain. And I don't believe this development is any different from that point of view, other than the 30-metre band of trees and everything. And it's disappointing that the developer hadn't put those in when they started, and then we'd be 2 years into the growth of those trees. So there will be a loss of decent view for the small number of residents that can actually see this, which is not a lot less, not a lot more than the ones at the last one we have approved. So I'm not swayed by the argument put, I'm afraid.
Okay, hang on, Tony, I'll just come back to you in a minute. Ernie, Councillor Clark.
Thanks, Chairman. Well, I must admit, having listened to what's been said so far, I'm afraid I can't agree with Councillor Trotman on this one. Certainly, Councillor Gibson made some good points. And what's been said, I know every application has to be taken on its own merits, but we appear to be deviating from what this committee has done in the past. The Lee Delamere has been mentioned, seemed a worse application, if that's the right phrase, than this one. We were happy for that to go through. And whilst I've got sympathy for the residents that are going to be looking at this, I can only say if the local member for Broughton Gifford were here, he or she, I can't remember who it is now, but I'm sure they'd be laughing their socks off because Broughton Gifford is absolutely surrounded by these things and nobody's sort of done anything about that. Yet all of a sudden, we're saying because there's a handful of people, and I do feel sorry for them, that we should be taking this into consideration. Well, every solar farm can be seen by people, but you have to weigh up the benefit of what's coming. And as was said just now, it's 6 months of pain when it's being constructed for perhaps 40 years of gain to it. And so I normally agree with Councillor Trotman, but I'm afraid on this one, I definitely won't be. Thanks,
Okay,
Chairman.
that's a fair point. Councillor Trotman.
If I could just come back on a couple of items. I've never brought in the agricultural usage because obviously I'm more concerned about the landscaping and the view of it. But also the officer did suggest that the trees and growth which will mitigate the views probably won't happen for 15 years. 15 years of looking at that. Fine. That is one of the problems. And also from what Ernie says, because we all work together on this, in this committee, there is now a distinctive overdevelopment of PV arrays in our area. And I believe that when we went, first of all, into accepting the PV arrays where they are now, there was an acceptance for it. There was the concern that we had to be carbon neutral by 2030. Now we've got to the stage now where we have to look at other things within the planning core policies that we have to be able to mitigate some of the objections that we have on these sites, as well as, looking to the supporters who obviously have to make this viable for themselves as a company. And also, I've got to think about it, but the parish councils who gain a substantial amount of money to be able to put back into the community. So there's a lot of advantages, but we have to look at all of it now, much more than we ever used to before. And I think this is a particular case where being right on the main road, the visual impact of this is not good. And I would suggest that all of those core policies that I've put in are still valid. I didn't ask you, but you've seconded it. Would you still accept the addition of this core policy 42, item 7, which Councillor Newbury suggested? There is core policy 42 also suggests the landscape, particularly in and around the AONB, but I don't think we can use that. But reading part of this, the landscape is affected, and core policy 2 is CPRE. Well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So I know it's difficult. Some of the others may want to speak for or against it. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, no, thank you for that. No, I absolutely take your point. I mean, I think it was said at the back, we've delivered 167% of the requirement. That doesn't mean that no more is not on, because we still can, but it does mean that we can be more critical, I guess, of those that are still coming forward. Beth, Councillor Threlfall.
Can I confirm a couple of things? Community benefits are not a planning issue and not something we should be taking into account in determining a planning application. And the other question, well, I've got a couple of questions, but another one is we've been told how this is going to be cheap electricity, but it doesn't make it cheap for any of us because the way our electricity system works in this country, we buy it at the cost to the highest, the highest cost. And everybody else just gets a bit more money. The manufacturers get more money for the cheaper production. Is that not correct?
In terms of the community benefits, correct, they're not a pertinent part of a decision-making process in this instance.
Yep, sure.
About the grass, I mean, technology is moving on so fast. I see that Ecotricity is now saying that they can make electricity out of grass using biodigesters. So perhaps grass is going to be of more value in the future for energy than we're giving it credit at the moment. And the final question, which is really a technical one, is about the height of the inverters. I know the panels have been reduced by 17% and are going to be 2.3 meters tall, but the inverters and the battery storage systems are presumably going to be substantially taller than that.
So the highest unit, which would contain inverters, etc., would be 3.6 metres tall.
So do we have any more questions, any more points, any more debate? No? In which case, Christopher, were you
No, I
going to
was just
speak
going
or
to say,
not?
I've got to leave in 5 minutes for my medical appointment, Chair. So if we can go to the vote, that is great.
The others may want to hold you up.
Yeah, you
Have a
covered
comfort
reasons
break
of
for 5
refusal.
minutes.
Well, probably no, I'm not 100% sure on the heart.
Yeah. Hang on. Yeah. Just hang on there.
What exactly is the concern? And then the second question was.
Yeah. Before I go to the vote, a couple of points of clarification, Tony, just to come to you. The ecology issue, we ought to delegate back to the officers. They're uncomfortable about that being a reason for refusal. The use of the landscape, that was they want a clarification on what you meant by that one.
Sorry, it was, sorry, it was just to basically describe what about the impacts you're concerned about, so the attributes of the development and how that affects the landscape, just to give us an idea how we would configure a reason for refusal.
You turn your mic on, Mike.
Sorry, Tony.
Core policy, sorry, 51. That's correct, isn't it? Yeah. It was number 1, which is the local distinctive pattern and species composition of natural features such as trees, hedgerows, woodland, field boundaries, watercourses and water bodies. It's the local distinctive pattern in that particular issue. Item 2, the local distinctive character of settlements in their landscape setting. That was really with the houses, which I would term as a Pewsham hamlet, you know, which obviously is a distinctive character along the A4. The item 5, landscape features of cultural, historic and heritage value. I know that's not, as I say, it isn't an archaeological plot, but it is of heritage value because it has been there for centuries as a landscape, you know, that is well known.
Okay.
The item 6, important views and visual amenity, probably carries a bit better value.
Yeah.
Thank you. Through you, Chair.
Chairman, could I just throw in
No,
quickly?
hang on just a minute. Hang on, get some new bits. So I just wanted to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you. That just on the setting of the heritage landscape, if you like. Just to confirm, are you concerned about the fields themselves, or is it the setting of the listed buildings on the other side of the road, for instance?
It was the field itself.
Okay.
Yeah, but there is a notion that it may well affect the historic buildings. Well, that's on a different core policy, isn't it?
The CPRE says the changes would impose on the landscape substantial built form features that would be incongruously different from the present land cover. I don't know if Tony might like to adopt that.
Put those words in. I'm not sure which core policy that.
Well, the officers were asking
It
us
is-
to
it is the same
give
as
some
core policy.
flesh on the bones of the landscape issue.
Yeah.
Did you pick up those words?
That
Yeah, you're okay with that? Okay. Buff, Councillor Thruffle, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to mention in terms of that, it's the coalescence of the extension of the two built environments getting closer and closer together. I mean, I do accept that there have been lots of good things done on this site for the biodiversity, but it is nonetheless an industrial site that's being proposed.
Right.
Can I just maybe
sure.
respond slightly on that? Are you suggesting that we should be including the coalescence within the reason for refusal as well? I only want to raise a point on the application which is adjoining the site, which objectors and others have mentioned, referred to the coalescence in terms of the reason for refusal. When that one was appealed, the planning inspector found that there was no coalescence through that development. So I just think that was the housing estate. So I just feel that we need to be very careful if we're going to suggest that there is coalescence.
No. No, I think we need to keep that one out. Yeah. It's a good point, but I don't think...
Which we can't deal with, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Or the officers wouldn't be able to support us.
Right, I'm going to go to the vote on this. I'm aware that there's dissension within our ranks. Yes, you... yeah.
That's enough.
Yes, you can. Right, okay then.
Okay, I will do it old school. Okay.
Thank you, Tara. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Okay, so Councillor Ernie Clark.
Against?
So this is against the motion, just to clarify to everyone in the room.
Yes.
Councillor Adrian Foster. Okay, Councillor Sarah Gibson. Okay, Councillor Carol King. Thank you. Councillor Christopher Newby.
4.
Okay, Councillor Pip Ridout. Councillor Elizabeth Threlfall.
4.
Councillor Robert Yule. Okay, Councillor Howard Greenman.
4.
And Councillor Tony Trotman. Okay, so that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 against, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. So the motion has fallen. So
Okay, that's fair enough.
we will need another motion.
So we need another motion. So, well, all three hands went up together. Sarah, Councillor Gibson then.
I'm not sure that that's the case, Adrian. In that case, given the fact that I think we have debated it, I think it's therefore, it's important that we debate these things, and I think it's important that as a committee we don't always agree. And one of the important things I think about this committee is that we do debate things with an enormous amount of care and consideration, and this is one of those occasions. And I think Adrian's mention of the Lee Delamere site to me is quite important, because we looked at the access at that, and the access was considerably more concerning on single track roads during the construction process. So obviously this is going to be an issue for that. But if you look at core policy 47, I really don't feel that we are in a position to say that we're not complying with that. So I'd make a motion to accept the officer's recommendation. And I'd need a seconder.
Right, yeah, Councillor Foster. Second to that.
I'm happy to second, but I wondered if there's anything that we can put in it to insist on a constructive and appropriate transport plan like we had before and did on the lead element.
Well, I would be much more comfortable with this if there was some kind of traffic management, particularly during the construction
We were able
period,
to put that
because
in.
that's the biggest issue for me personally.
We were able to put that in as a condition on the last one, and I'd like to see the same happen on this one.
Yes. So I'm going to come back on that one, Jonathan, because that's a game changer for me personally.
Howard, sorry, interjection, but we were able to add that at the end of the Lee Delamere one and make it conditioned that an appropriate traffic plan
Parking
was put in
spaces and
place.
so on.
Yeah,
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 that's right.
And I think the same. I think the only, my experience of traffic is limited as the years on the council, but the Rowford one, this Silverwood, overcame that by putting a temporary traffic light system in, and I think that would be appropriate here, and that might save a few lives.
Yeah, I'd be much more comfortable with that.
But just to clarify, so we already do have a condition that covers construction management. So you're wanting to see an additional measure to be included that deals with the management of traffic
Yes.
to entering and coming from the site during the construction phase?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right, Adrian, isn't it? Adrian? We've already got a construction management plan in place.
Page 47.
What we're asking for, is that there be an additional measure in there for construction traffic to and from the site during the period of, yes, that is right.
Okay, that's fine. To include that, yeah. As I say, there's already a condition there. that we can add to it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I can't, just trying to find the condition, does it limit it to times of the day? And you said it was on page 47, and I'm sorry, I just can't seem to find it.
Yes. So we have a construction management plan condition on page 47, condition 11, which includes details of traffic routing signs, both at site accesses and along the construction routes.
Past with these sort of developments had a clear condition that construction traffic will be limited to certain times of the day and obviously not
Yeah,
after
that's not in
lunchtime on
there.
Saturdays.
What we've got there, I think, are fairly standard conditions, but we don't have times of day.
I think that's something that would be reasonable to.
Yeah.
And I think that would be, because
I think this, sorry, I think this comes down to the fact that we don't have a detailed traffic plan, and that's what we need to have.
That's right. Yeah.
and I know it's not a condition that we can add, but we might ask that if this application is approved, that we encourage the applicant to start the mitigating planting on the outskirts of the site as early as possible.
Yes, so can we put
Tomorrow.
that as an,
Yeah.
so put that in as an informative? Yeah. To start the planting ASAP, rather than leave it to the end of the scheme, given that there is going to be a period of.
I mean, I appreciate that they often do leave it to the end because it makes access to the site better. But if there is an opportunity for the majority of it to be planted prior to construction of the rest,
Yes,
that
that
would be
makes-
appreciated.
Makes a lot of sense, yeah, yeah.
One other thing about transport, could we put a condition on or an advisory that vehicles must not park on the main road? If vehicles turn up to offload and the site is closed because they're too early, they're going to have to park somewhere. So is it possible either to have a sort of like a parking area within the site or just prevent?
Yes, I'm not too
vehicles
sure how we'd
from parking?
encapsulate that, but I get the spirit of what you're saying. Is there any way we can control off-road parking so that if vehicles turn up when vehicles are leaving?
Just a point.
Safe passage of vehicles, basically.
Just a point there, Mr. Chair. The garage on the left-hand side, the Fiat garage, quite often, regularly, probably on a daily basis, parks a lorry on that A4 and to discharge and unload the cars on either side. So I think it would be impossible to put, unfortunately, a condition like that on another developer on that same
Does
site.
it? Okay.
There wouldn't be consistency. But I take the point, and maybe Lord Lansdowne could provide if on the right-hand side of his big development there is a big car park which isn't used to a great extent, he might suggest that to the developer himself.
Sorry, it's simpler just to put an informative, well, it ought to be a condition really, that all construction traffic, is contained on site. I think, thinking about it, with that sort of slightly wet area there, coming in and out of there is going to be a sort of a problem anyway with mud discharge and so on, but it needs to be kept off of that road, I think, yeah. I would think the officers.
Yeah, I think they're crafting something between themselves now.
Sorry, can I just
Yeah,
come
go
in?
on.
Yeah, the condition, sorry, I forget the number now, condition 11, it refers back to an existing construction management plan that has been submitted. And a lot of the things that are being referenced are included in that management plan. I was busily trying to scroll through it to see what's included and what isn't. What I suggest, and it's for members obviously to advise us, is that we've encapsulated all of the comments that you've referenced, including the hours of operation, hours of construction, etc. We take that with us and we make sure that all of those things are included in the construction management plan. So your resolution will reflect that, and if it isn't included in that management plan, we will ensure the condition compels a new version to be submitted and agreed. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So that will be in the next version of the minutes, so we need to.
This comes back to Ashley's point. It's a shame that this information isn't provided to us prior to the debates rather than finding out at the end of the debate.
So can I just check that the proposer and the seconder were happy with, as the suggestion? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Right, so on that note, I'll go once more to the vote then. So all in favour of that proposal? 2, 3, 4, 6. And against? Yeah, well, that's easily been carried. That's 6 to 3 then. So that later proposal has been carried. Thank you for that. And it has been approved. There are no urgent items. So I'd like to thank all members and all members of the public for attending. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And safe journeys home. Thank you.